Hello, this is Larry Bailey with Kensiemae, and today, February 5th, 2018, Ellie Mae has dropped 18.1.0.3 across all platforms for production unless you've somehow negotiated your way to opt out. Welcome to 18.1. We've had this in testing for a little bit, but of course, like anything else, you never really know how it's going to react in your production until it's in your production. So on the screen, you should be seeing the first page of release notes. I always recommend always go to how the volume ends first. So if we scroll down to the end of the release notes, we'll see what's happened since the last time you looked. Always very important. So the last change we have on here was Jan 17, talking about new option added to the condition setting to automate document container creation. If you're using TPO Connect, this is a big deal if you're using TPO Connect on having those documents created. There's a problem that's now been resolved. So the feature will only be functional though with an Encompass TPO future release. So although it's going to resolve it, just keep in mind it's not actually in effect. It's just sitting there. Ellie Mae's done this before with some other settings. Usually turns out okay. It's just they don't want to update the code until they're actually ready. Some previous notes on here. January 5th. Again, if you've read about this, updates to the rate spread field. So that's been something that's been happening. Some other pieces going back up in time, going back up to December 15th in this case. Everybody should have seen it. Again, mandatory fields for the new HMDA profile settings. Make sure you have an understanding of what's going on there. You can see how Ellie Mae ranks this out where they add new entries. And then if we go back up to the very beginning, again, December 15, again, issue resolved where you are getting an issue of an unused organization in your organization users hierarchy, as well as Spring Creators update. There were some issues with some Microsoft 10 updates not playing well with Encompass. So now that we got through those change events, we go back up to the beginning. Some of the things that are really important in this release are as follows. Like in all major updates, this one is no stranger. You want to make sure that you're updating your SDK. If you need those download links to update your SDK, you'll find them here on this page. If you didn't already update your SDK right now, your APIs your apps are probably crashing because they're seeing a server version mismatch. So go ahead and get that updated as soon as you can. So as we talked about a few seconds ago, Windows 10 Spring Creator is now updated to be supported within Encompass. So if you were having some issues with that, hopefully this makes that resolution happen for you. If you're running with biweeklies, Encompass now supports them. Personally, don't have any experience with running biweeklies through Encompass. I know there have always been some workarounds for companies that need to work with them. At this point now, you've got some language on the loan estimate, as well as a closing disclosure that hopefully resolves having to do those workarounds and those custom print forms. Also, as you see, the aggregate analysis has been updated for biweeklies. Again, something that was really hard to do, impossible to do in Encompass before now. So again, if you don't have, by the way, if you don't have a testing environment, so if you haven't been working with 18.1 over the last few couple months, really, because you don't have a testing environment, get with your Ellie Mae rep and get one. They're really traditionally very reasonably priced, worth every penny, and it'll give you a chance to really see what's happening. Even if you don't keep both of your environments fully updated, it'll at least give you a chance to see how some of these settings are going to be rolled out before they roll into your production. So definitely advise you to get that. If you've got Encompass Banker, even if you don't have a development team, at least get a testing environment so you can be aware of some of these changes before they get to your production. If you're working with construction loans, so again, some updated monthly payment ratios for the ATRQM calc. Not very many problems with that, but there were some issues again with the construction phase of not really Encompass not really handling or understanding how to handle that that ATRQM qualification for that construction phase. So 18.1 tries to address that. This is important too. If you're working with USDA loans on the Encompass forms and tools, you'll see Ellie's updated this section because they've received additional guidance. So if you're not familiar, when Ellie Mae touches anything on forms, things like this, forms and tools, do yourself a favor, check your user groups, check your personas across the board. You can use some of the settings reports just to make sure that everybody, all your personas and user groups have remained untouched. There are some issues reported on Basecamp. Um, very, very few, but there was at least one person who had reported an issue where their user groups have been reset. It's not entirely uncommon. Sometimes when Ellie goes through a major, if you made any changes just before the major, sometimes there's some issues with those updated changes making it over to your revised implementation with your major. So go back. It's always a good idea to make sure you double check proactively if you have the resources to do that. Anytime Ellie Mae is touching forms and tools. You'll also need to go through there because Ellie Mae has also updated some print forms, which I'll talk about in 1 second. If you are working with purchase advice, again, depending on how you have your reporting database set up, there were were 5 fields that were updated to now handle 6 decimal places instead of uh, instead of what they were prior. Something else that's really interesting, it's not really talked about, it's kind of here in the highlights, but a new loan file sequence number is now in the reporting database. There were some issues. Obviously, you can run field data entry rules to making sure your loan numbers don't get changed. But there actually there is an open issue. Sometimes 2 loans can get created at the same time with the same loan number. If your Encompass instance is requested to create a new loan at the same exact time, multiple users, you can actually accidentally create more than one loan number or more than one loan with the same loan number. Hopefully, this acts as a backstop so you can check your loan sequence like you would in any normal DB. So hopefully that'll solve for that kind of a problem. And this is where I was talking about with consolidation. So Ellie's consolidated the 4506, both classic and non-classic, into one print form in the Encompass print window. So if you're going out and printing, instead of seeing page 1, page 2, that kind of a thing, you'll now see the little green icon, which indicates a consolidation of the print forms. And furthermore, when you get into so down here in the print notes, there's also been some migration of docs into the Encompass Docs solution. Again, not a terribly upsetting ordeal. Just make sure your environment's behaving properly with regards to those print forms. Sometimes if you have business rules or if you have any customization in terms of who can access those forms, just make sure that again your settings are what you expect them to be. Amortization schedule, and you can read the list. I mean, there's not that many, but you'll need to make sure that again you test this out, make sure everything's still good for you. To continue on here, some more updates worth mentioning. Fannie Mae file imports now, so your 3.2, could be considerable changes for you. Number one, the estimated close date field is now being imported into Encompass. I'm not sure how I feel about that. If you're importing a 3.2, it's probably because you're you're accepting that file. You're not using a website, a TPO website, so you're accepting that file from another LOS. Don't really know what that estimated close date is on that other LOS, so I'm not sure how I feel about that coming into mine. However, just keep in mind that it's something that is coming in the 3.2s now. Again, another big update here, incremental, but to me, I think it's pretty big. It's bringing in a lock icon has been added to the other proposed monthly housing expense. So on your page 2, if you import it in and you've got it locked, it'll still import the values here. But again, if you've got that lock icon, it'll ensure that the value is not being recalculated. So again, the concern here is that you've got it locked under the other proposed. Somebody puts something on their LOS. Your methodology is to make sure there's no locks. Somebody unlocks it and then throws in this extra value in your 1003 unexpectedly, and it throws ratios off. So just keep an eye on that if you're in the business of importing Fannie 3.2 files. Ellie's done some updates to give you some notification on when you're meeting or nearing your Encompass user license limit. You can read about that in terms of what those messages are. Obviously, work with your Ellie Mae account management team, making sure you've got the correct number of enabled licenses. Also, just as a reminder, this is more of a house cleaning thing. Go through your settings in your all user list. Make sure that you don't just have logins disabled. Make sure you have accounts disabled. So this goes for any queue users or any testing users. It's pretty good practice to making sure you've got only your true live people that are working and having their accounts enabled, that you're not overspending on account seats when you don't need them. This is again where you're focusing in on the HMDA profile settings, mandatory respondent information fields. Review that setting. If you're working with TPO, this is again pretty big. You want to make sure you understand what's going on here. If you're working with TPO Connect, there were some changes. Take your time to go through here and understand what's happening on these on the external company site. There's changes, there's language differences, there's changes to the company details basic info tab. There's also an update to the external company setup in terms of what those labels look like. And then what's pretty cool here is you can actually now have a TPO Connect site status. So when your internal, let's say your internal milestone says approved or something like that, and you want the TPO Connect status to have something other than that, here's where you can now define that within the milestone details. I'm not quite sure how this is going to behave going backwards. I wouldn't expect any change going backwards, but if you do update your milestone templates with this new TPO Connect status information, just make sure that, again, you test this out and that you don't have any adverse reactions to your existing milestone templates. And then, of course, make sure you don't have, if you have more than one TPO milestones template, make sure you update all of them so that how your TPO customer interacts with their pipeline is consistent. If we keep on going down here, again, there's as we spoke about in the beginning of this, there's although it's not enabled, there will soon, hopefully, be a setting to automate the document container creation. Again, if you're using TPO Connect. Moving on into if you're using investor templates, again, just a label change. It's more of a hey, heads up thing. The investor name has been changed to template name. So create edit investor template is still up here, but now they just have template name. The investor is down here. So it's just a little cleaning up, making sure labeling makes sense on there. And it just some instructions on how to get into the area to access the loan pricing decimal places setting. If you're getting into trade management, then you'll want to take just a few minutes to read about this. There was there's always been around trade management. Trade management was created to basically utilize the Encompass SDK to automatically update loans without having to go in them. So for those companies that have been using trade management, there's always been a few things that have been on the wish list. If you assign a loan to a trade and then you pull it out, there's always been this issue of tracking. So what 18.1 does for you now is assign that canceled or withdrawn date to that loan, depending on how you handle that bulk correspondent trades. So again, it's Encompass trying to become more of a correspondence tool, so you don't have to keep doing all this extra work outside of Encompass. And then if you do get into option premiums, I personally have never done that, but if you're getting into trading options, you now have an ability to do that. Go ahead and test that out and see how that's going to work for you. Diagnostic Tool, I posted this on Basecamp not too long ago. There is a new option within diagnostics called Just in Time. The thing about this that I just bring up is it does capture personally identifiable information or non-public information. PII and NPI are always very, very sensitive information. So if you do capture this and you are transmitting this over to Ellie Mae for their diagnostic, or anybody else to that matter for their diagnostic interpretation, just keep in mind that that information is there, and you have to make sure it's transmitted in a secure method. And so again, just keep everybody's information safe. Last thing before we get into the fixes that 18.1 presents. So if you're working with SDK, sometimes you could get into this issue of opening a loan, then locking the loan, and who was in it, and was there any corruption? So, and getting that open. So there is what Ellie's done is just give you a new loan file sequence number comparison logic. So that way you're not effectively saving an old copy of the loan because of who opened it first. So if you're working in the again using your SDKs, you'll want to make sure you understand again how this new logic works, so that um, you can make sure you're grabbing the correct instance of that loan and committing the changes to the correct instance, so that the changes are being saved as you expect. All right, so now we get into things that Ellie Mae says they fixed at Encompass. Some of the big things that you might not have even known were a problem with FHA MIP was sometimes improperly calculating on lock request form. So that's been resolved. Some of the other things that have gone through that are more uh, more specific to obviously if you're doing some trades, you'll have some updates on how those lock expiration fields are calculating for correspondent trades. Um, and again, going back to loans allocated for correspondent trades, so some work was done around obviously the trades tab as we spoke about. Then you get into some state specific. If you're working with state specific forms and you notice any irregularities to Oregon or Connecticut, that was addressed. Also, if you were working with dashboards and you were noticing that the manage snapshot button wasn't always working properly, that's been resolved in 18.1. Again, state specific, going over to North Carolina compliance report, you'll now see the property type is populating correctly. When you get into Encompass settings, some of the things that are to be fixed in this release, we were seeing some issues with the organizational hierarchy. So sometimes it would fail out and give you an error. That was happening a few weeks ago. That's been resolved. You can now add your settlement service provider additional information field to the RDB. That was also creating an issue. You might have noticed. In case you tried to add it, now you can. Setting sync tool. So again, just something to be really, really careful with. It's the setting sync tool is getting more attention now. Again, as next gen is getting prepped to get closer and closer, there's going to be some opportunities where you'll want to copy settings from one environment to another. Just word of caution, please be very careful with this, and make sure that as far as copying rules over from instance to instance, it's always best practice to make sure you do that manually over. It's a great time to double check to make sure that the rules that you're copying from one environment to the other contain the fields that you expect and contain the logic that's best practice in terms of consolidation of lines of code, those kinds of things. So just be aware that these two errors do exist, or did exist rather, and were causing problems with the tool. According to Ellie Mae, they've been resolved now. Some more things that were resolved in terms of persona access to Encompass, again, for Consumer Connect. Maybe you were having some issues on that if you're using Consumer Connect, so you can read about that. And then Ellie's citing some performance improvement with persona access to forms, save a little bit quicker. If you're using TPO Connect, again, TPO is now populating correctly for the county field, so that's good news. When we get into the server side, Ellie's talking about what's been happening on the server side. New HMDA loan purpose field is updated on the server side. Again, not a big thing, but I wanted to make sure you know that it's happened. On the client side, which is really what everybody interacts with on that client when you load up Encompass, there are updates to the HMDA property valuation. Again, better alignment to what we need to have on our HMDA reports. You'll also notice that the appraised value on the lock request form is now behaving as expected and is not changing. Some of the client side updates again, we should be on 18.1.0.3 as you're listening to this. If you were to look back at .2, Ellie's just describing things that they updated in those small updates, those hot fixes, specific to the 2018 HMDA reporting fields with the rate spread. That had come up. And also the 203K worksheet for the existing debt, if you're using that, there was an issue where the pop-up window was not accessible. That's been resolved. So again, if you went right from 17, excuse me, if you went right from 17.4 to 18.1.0.3, you wouldn't even notice this. Also, if you had any issues where user details in the Encompass settings, in other words, if you went in through, if you were opening up a user account and you were having issues with accessing the user settings on there, now that's been resolved. I didn't have any reports of that, so I'm not really sure where this error was happening. But apparently there were some problems. So if you're having any issues, obviously report them up to Ellie Mae. Some things that were resolved specifically in .3, the HMDA 2018 demographic information indicator, that was behaving a little odd. So Ellie looked at that and addressed those issues to repair them and get them working properly. If you were having to use a workaround, it's just to be noted you should not need to use a workaround anymore. At this point, it should be working properly. Last thing to cover here is apparently Ellie was getting reports where when a persona had limited access to a file, they were getting an error that said that the loan cannot be saved as a more recent version of the loan may already be available on the server. So that issue's been resolved. Again, not really familiar with it personally on this, but if you were seeing that, it hopefully is resolved for you now in 18.1.0.3. So the rest of this information down at the bottom for the last 11 pages are the updates to the notes that we've already been we talked about up front. So hopefully this has been helpful for you. Again, it should be typically business as usual. A few little updates in the 18.1 that we spoke about. Certainly, if you have any continued need of support, utilize the Ellie Mae Encompass user forum. Use the Encompass Basecamp. Reach out for your support teams. Reach us out for us here at Kensiemae. Be glad to assist in any way possible. Hope you have a great day. Thank you.